Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Keith Gross, who is fighting in the congressional race in Florida. Keith, welcome to the Liz Truss Show. You are fighting to be a representative in Congress. You're a MAGA Republican. Why is it so important for MAGA to do well at this election?
Well, I think this movement to make America great again is really still just picking up steam. President Trump's doing his part in the White House. He's been working to lower taxes for people, working to rebalance bad foreign trade deals wherein America has gotten ripped off by countries like China for many decades, and that's impacted employment here in America. It's made it harder for people to earn a living. And that's really what makes it all so important, is making life affordable for Americans again and making sure that our country's government works for our country's citizens.
And we have seen quite a lot of Republicans who haven't necessarily backed President Trump in Congress, in the Senate. What can be done about that? Because the agenda that President Trump outlined, the executive orders, they really ought to have been put into legislation. So how can that be changed?
Well, that's certainly one of the things that I've pledged to do from day one as the next congressman from the Florida Panhandle, is to introduce all of the executive orders that have not already been codified into law, to introduce them as legislation so that they can be put into the law, making it harder for them to be undone by future administrations. The disparity between different types of Republicans has never been more obvious than it is right now. I call it, like you've got the Mitch McConnell type Republicans, and then you've got Donald Trump type Republicans. I'm a 100% Donald Trump Republican because I believe that we've got to make sure our government works for everyone here in our country. The working class of America was forgotten and left behind for decades by both parties in the past, and President Trump's putting them first.
Well, we have the same issue here in Britain, which is working class areas of our country were left behind. We're now seeing a political revolution taking place because the voters are so frustrated. That's why they voted for Brexit. That's why they're now voting for non-mainstream parties in Britain, because they're not seeing that alternative offered by the mainstream parties. And of course, Donald Trump has completely transformed the Republican Party. So why is it, given that he has this clear electoral mandate, that there are still senators refusing to vote for Trump policies?
Well, I certainly have my own opinions, and I'm not sure what the real reason is, but from my perspective, it appears that a lot of times when people go to Congress, they get elected, and then they become focused on how to earn re-election continually, rather than what's best for the people that sent them there in the first place. As a result, they often take huge donations from lobbyists and special interest groups, and rather than being loyal to the citizens that elected them, they become loyal to the people writing massive checks, which is why I've used my own money. I've had a great career in business. I'm not running for Congress because I need a job or a career. I'm currently funding my own campaign, and I've already pledged to donate my congressional salary to make it clear that I will be loyal to the people of my district, never special interest groups or lobbyists. And I think if we had more people going into Congress with that sort of self-made wealth, it would make a big difference because people wouldn't be so worried about how they're going to get reelected. They could focus on actually doing the job required of them, putting the interests of the people first.
What we saw in Britain is a lot of MPs looking to jobs after they left Parliament, so taking particular positions on net zero or climate change or defence because they wanted a job after office. So you're pledging essentially not to be influenced by that, to be independent. And I think it's so important, and I see this happen a lot in the US, that people go from business into politics. We saw Elon Musk working with President Trump early on in his administration. We've seen people like Scott Bessent go in to politics. But what I see in Britain is businesses are still sitting on the sidelines. They're afraid to stand up and be counted. What would you say to them about why it's so necessary for people who are entrepreneurs, who are from the private sector, to go into politics?
Well, I think when we think about government, we should be looking at it as a spending apparatus. It continually spends more than it takes in here in the United States, which is why our deficit continues to grow, and it's why our national debt continues to grow. Business owners know that you can't continuously spend more than you take in because that leads to bankruptcy. The same is true for nations, even though it takes a bit longer to materialize. When we look at the benefits of putting a business person in office, it's really that. It's someone that knows what it means to have families depend on them, someone that has written paychecks and knows how to balance a budget. I think if we were to send more people like that to Congress, we would have better results because they would be focused on things that actually work instead of things that make good TV.
That is certainly true, and one of the problems we have in Britain is we don't have those type of people, particularly in the current government. There's nobody with any business experience. The government is now spending 45% of our national income, and the country hasn't been in surplus for 25 years. And we're also seeing the debt building up in America. We're seeing the debt build up across Western Europe. One of the issue with democratic politics is that politicians tend to want to offer things to voters, so they're reluctant to make those changes. Are you going to be tough enough to take that on?
Absolutely. I mean, I've seen it firsthand. You know, when I was a young person back in my college years, in my early 20s, I also thought Democrat policies sounded like a great idea because on paper they do, right? Free stuff for everyone, that sounds so kind and so nice. But as a certain leader in your nation used to say, eventually you run out of other people's money. And that's the problem with socialist policies generally. It's the problem with Democrats in the United States here. It's that they want to continually give things out for free and they're not focused on how to actually pay for it. I would propose that anytime we offer a new spending program, we should ensure that it is coupled with a new tax so that people see a direct connection between the taxes and the spending. Right now, politicians deceive people into thinking they can get benefits without paying because they give the benefit today, run up the national debt today, and all we're doing is kicking this can down the road so that our children and grandchildren have to figure out the problem. It's not fair, and it's not the way to run a nation.
But there are some people, such as Mandami and AOC, who have been quite successful at getting younger people on board, essentially advocating communist policies and saying that people will get free stuff. And there has been a shift, particularly amongst young women, to the left. How can that be combated?
I think we've got to have real conversations that there is no such thing as free stuff. Unfortunately, our education system has been infiltrated by people with Marxist ideologies, and they continually push this idea that the wealthy aren't paying enough in taxes, that if we just tax them more, we can afford to take care of the perceived underdog, the people who earn less. Our tax system is already dramatically tilted against those who earn more. The top 1% earn approximately 20% of the income, but pay approximately 40% of all income taxes. They're already paying more than twice their fair share. And so when you look at that sort of disparity, it makes sense logically, but the people who are listening to the pitches made by Marxists, people like Bernie Sanders, they're not behaving logically at all. They're just having a low information, emotional reaction to the concept of wealth divides, that's a real problem, but it's driven more by the lack of jobs, the lack of real earning power, driven by bad foreign trade deals more than anything else.
And also by domestic legislation. You know, if you look at what's happening in California, what's happening in New York, people are leaving those areas because they have been taxed, they've been regulated, the energy costs are higher, and they are moving to states like Florida and they're voting with their feet. How can the Florida dream be replicated across the US?
You know, it's about getting government out of the way so people can prosper. It's about not having a government that tries to control every aspect of our lives. A recent example in federal legislation was President Trump's repeal of certain regulations that were made up by unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats. So the start-stop button that we have in a lot of brand new automobiles here, whenever you stop at a stoplight or an intersection, it shuts down the car's engine and then restarts it when the car is prepared to go again. That saves maybe 5-10 seconds of burning fuel, but in the end, it ends up costing a lot more. And the reality is, we've been governed by this rule that was never passed by our elected representatives in Congress. It was made up by bureaucrats in agencies. And that's not the way our government's supposed to work. We're supposed to be ruled by those that we put in power at the ballot box, not by some random employee in an agency somewhere. Regulations like this can be eliminated through congressional action or through executive action. President Trump's working on the executive action part of it, but in Congress we need to do a better job of taking back that power and reducing the regulatory burden, because all it does is drive up costs in a lot of instances. You mentioned California and their excessive regulations. One of the silliest regulations they put into place a while back was banning plastic straws, like it was going to solve this massive global ocean plastic problem. And then you can find plenty of images on the internet of people in India dumping truckloads of plastic debris into rivers that flow into the ocean. Plastic straws in California were never the problem, just as emissions in the United States are not generally the biggest problem if we're concerned about emissions at all. Generally, those issues are found in developing nations like China. They're not restricting their business, which is why they're unfairly competing with ours.
That's certainly true about the plastic straws, and I tried to stop the plastic straw ban here in Britain, but unfortunately we had a Conservative government that was often Conservative in name only, and they wanted to virtue signal to the media, to virtue signal to the general the general atmosphere in Britain, which has become increasingly left-wing as left-wingers have taken over the elites, they've taken over the media, they've taken over our institutions. You were talking about the bureaucracy, and in Britain we have more than 444 quangos, which are so-called independent bodies. They're funded by the government, and these people are making decisions about our lives. They're completely unaccountable. I believe that we just need to get rid of those, and it was one of the things that left-wing governments did, is build up all of those bodies. What hope do you think is there of dismantling some of that bureaucratic edifice that has been created in the United States?
Well, here there has been a recent series of Supreme Court decisions that has started to dismantle the concept of an independent bureaucracy. Our Constitution doesn't provide for a fourth branch of government in the bureaucracy. It states that we have an executive branch, which is supposed to execute laws, and a legislative branch, which is supposed to write them. We shouldn't be governed by laws that are written by people who were not elected. And the Supreme Court seems to be moving towards that interpretation of eliminating executive branch agencies' ability to effectively legislate. This all started back, many decades ago, when the prevailing minds of the time believed that we should be ruled by experts, that experts know best and we should all just listen to them and trust them to run our lives. Increasingly, people are seeing that experts are not always right, and even if they were, that doesn't mean they should run our lives. This really came to a head during COVID, when there were massive misinformation pieces output by so-called experts, and we found in the end that most of the experts were wrong about many key facts. I think that really undermined people's trust in some expert rule. And that's important, because if we're to be ruled by ourselves, then we should have the freedom to make wrong decisions, not have an expert tell us what is best and force us to follow that advice.
The ultimate expert body in government, as far as I know, is the central bank. And we have a Bank of England that was made unaccountable by Tony Blair. It has made terrible decisions about things like quantitative easing. It's driven inflation. The Federal Reserve often comes under criticism, and President Trump has criticized the policies under the previous leadership of the Federal Reserve. Do you think the Federal Reserve needs to be reined in? Do you think it has too much unelected power and is unaccountable to people that are actually elected?
Our Federal Reserve Bank is certainly unaccountable. It doesn't exist anywhere in our constitutional frame of government, so somehow the people have lost control of one of the most important aspects of their economic existence, their currency. And while on paper the design of the central bank was created with the intention of blocking inflation and stopping some political influence in spending and such, it's failed. It's failed miserably. If the goal was to manage and halt inflation via a detached central bank, it has not worked. We've got massive inflation. The value of our currency has been debased and continues to get worse each year. The amount that you can put into savings is irrelevant when that amount becomes less valuable due to huge inflation. The central bank hasn't done a very good job of its core purpose. And for that reason, I think we would be better off putting it back in the hands of the people's elected representatives, because this whole concept of a detached bank has failed.
And what we see, of course, is coordination between the central banks, between the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, the ECB, and they have pursued policies that are not necessarily in the interests of the people of our countries. Instead, they serve a global elite class that have benefited from policies like quantitative easing. They benefited from the bailout of the banks post the financial crisis. To what extent do you think that the Trump administration can take on the wider Davos elite? I know that you're taking it on within the United States, but it is a powerful global force. What more can be done to take these people on?
You know, the people, that's the force. The people here in America have got to change the way they vote, change how they hold our elected officials accountable, and demand results. Because, quantitative easing, that's just one of the many big problems that face us on the global stage when it comes to currency manipulation. China's been eating American businesses for lunch for a long time because of currency manipulation. The same thing could be said of Japan. While we're certainly an ally of Japan, the reality is, in America, many Japanese vehicles are on the road, and until we allowed them to start manipulating their currency and eased our restrictions on imports of Japanese vehicles, we had a massive automobile manufacturing industry here domestically that we don't anymore. Those jobs have all gone overseas, and we've allowed it to happen through bad foreign trade deals, poor policy management with regard to our currency. If we're going to see a change here, it's got to happen from the bottom up, from the people. They've got to vote differently. They've got to hold people accountable. America is special. We have a special culture that's different than other cultures, just like your country has a special culture that's different from others. We shouldn't allow this dilution to happen with open border policies, mass migration, and a failure to assimilate. We've got to protect and defend our cultures, or they will not exist the way we know them.
And Florida is, of course, working very hard to stop illegal immigration. What more needs to be done on that front to protect Americans' borders?
We need to take a more comprehensive approach in our country. Of course, we need to round up and mass deport the people that have poured into our nation illegally by the millions. But beyond that, we need to strengthen the legal system that makes it possible for them to remain. There shouldn't be an easy possibility to find employment, to use our banking system, to get loans, etc. But all of those things are easily accessible to someone who shouldn't be here at all. We already have the technology available. We just need to start enforcing those laws. If you were to harbor, say, a known fugitive from justice, somebody that maybe committed a horrific crime and they're running from the police, if you were to give them a job and give them a bank card and give them a place to live, you could be prosecuted for aiding and abetting a fugitive from justice. We need to start treating similarly the illegal aliens in this nation who are certainly fugitives from justice. We should also implement more serious policies. We shouldn't just send people back to their home country with a slap on the wrist. We should make serious consequences. They should have to serve time in prison, pay massive fines, forfeit their assets if they can't pay those fines. I think if we started to create this sort of disincentive, we would see more voluntary compliance with the law. Right now, there's no consequence, so we shouldn't be surprised that illegal aliens are routinely ignoring our laws.
But it's a lot better than it was under the Biden administration, where people were deliberately being brought in. And we're seeing the same thing happen in Europe with left-wing governments in Spain deliberately flooding the country with migrants, giving those migrants the ability to vote. There's a left-wing cabal that is in charge in much of Europe that is trying to do that. They work in league with the Democrats in the United States. How do we take on their destructive ideas and their destructive network?
We've got to speak out about these things vocally, and we've got to get people involved. Like I said, the power comes from the bottom up. People have to vote differently. Look around the world. It's no accident that simultaneously around the world, foreigners have been imported into nations unlawfully. They've been rigging elections through illegal voting. We've got massive dilution of cultures worldwide. It's not just a problem in America. It's not just a problem in one or two countries in Europe. It's a massive across the board thing that's happening. And for a long time, people would have said that replacement migration is some conspiracy theory. Well, today you can see that it's pretty clear, it's real, and it shows up in the math, it shows up in the polls. Simple things like securing elections and making it so that only U.S. citizens can vote in our elections are one step in the right direction. But even getting that issue passed through the Senate has proven nearly impossible. Over 80% of Americans in both parties generally agree with the concept of voter ID and proving that you're a U.S. citizen to vote in our elections. But even something as simple as that hasn't made it through. People can't forget about these things and get distracted and move on. They've got to remain focused and demand that people in power enact key policies to protect our nation.
Why did that not get through the Senate? Because my understanding is the Senate went into recess without having passed that law.
So there's a rule in the Senate that requires 60 votes rather than a simple majority to pass things. This rule, of course, can be overturned by a simple majority. So it's generally a matter of politeness and deferring to the minority party which isn't in power by letting them block progress for the majority party. I don't think that that's a good idea. Whenever the other side is in power, they're very likely to ignore that rule and push whatever policies they want. I remember it wasn't very long ago that we had millions of illegals coming across our border, and rather than the minority party at the time, our party, the Republican Party, shutting down the government and demanding accountability, they just rubber stamped Biden's budget request, let it happen time after time. Now that the shoe's on the other foot, the Democrat Party is in the minority. They don't like a lot of policies that President Trump is properly enacting in accordance with the Constitution, yet they're using their minority ability to stop spending, to halt bill passage, and to shut down our budget whenever possible. Republicans need to understand that one side uses every tool available to them, yet we voluntarily surrender half of our power to be polite to a party that is trying to destroy our nation. It's the most illogical, unilateral disarmament I have ever seen.
It is true even more so in Britain that many figures on the right are more concerned about convention, about being polite, than they are about defeating the left. And the left have evil intentions. What they want to do is they want to destroy our civilization through a combination of communism, Islamism, environmental zealotry. Why is it that so many people who are allegedly on our side can't see that we are in a war? We are in a war against this ideology.
I think it may be because they exist in some protected bubble where all they do is go to fancy parties and talk to lobbyists and have fundraisers. They don't understand the real danger that's happening because they choose not to pay attention. That's why it's important that we change people out. We shouldn't have the same people in power for decades. Our government's supposed to be ran by a legislature that comes from the people. It was never supposed to be a long-term career to be in Congress. You're supposed to come from your community, represent your community in Congress for a while, and then go back home and go have a real job. Congress is not a real job. More people need to understand that.
That's after spending 14 years in Parliament, I completely agree with you. I think it's there's an atmosphere there, and you call it the swamp, and we call it the blob, but it sort of infects people. It infects people, and they become part of the system. And what we need is people who aren't part of the system to help dismantle the system that's been created in our countries that isn't working for people. You talked earlier about replacement, and I noticed that the State Department is now using this term about migration. What's the discussion that's gone on within the Republican Party to shift the Overton window on actually talking about that issue?
Well, I think they're moving it out of this conspiracy theory land where only crazy people think there's replacement migration. Now we have an administration willing to address mathematical facts, which is that we are being replaced. The percentage of Americans that are white used to be dramatically higher just a couple of decades ago. And if you extrapolate these graphs forward, you'll see that people that have been in America since its beginning are less represented than they have been in the past, and that only becomes more pronounced over time. It's important that America continue to be the nation it was supposed to be in accordance with our Constitution. When we allow people to come in from other cultures, that can be a great thing, provided they assimilate into our culture, adopt American values, and perhaps help us build and expand the fabric of our society. What we're seeing happen more often is something that is most pronounced in New York recently. The people that elected Mamdani, a communist, for mayor, most of those voters that voted for him were foreign born. That tells us that we've invited so many people into our nation so quickly that they are outvoting American citizens that have been here for generations. That means that they're imposing third world values on our citizens. The people that flee third world countries come here because America is special, it's unique, and it's better than the country they left. And so it's a bit ironic and foolish that we would allow those people to enact those broken ideologies on us after they arrive, rather than reasonably demand that they assimilate into our culture, adopt our values, and live with us, not force us into their way of life.
And has there been a decision by the State Department to go harder on this issue? And particularly with respect to Europe and what's happening with Europe?
Clearly, they've been making overt statements recognizing that it's replacement migration. They've pointed out what's happened in a lot of European nations, which have massive numbers of immigrants and corresponding issues related to crime. Unusual crimes that might be common in Muslim-majority countries are now being pushed onto relatively high-trust societies in Europe. People that used to be able to walk down the street and trust their neighbors are often encountering people that are more like visiting a foreign land than the neighbors they're used to seeing. And for a lot of us, I think we're starting to feel like we're visitors in our own country. And definitely, our administration here is taking that issue more seriously. We've seen Vice President J.D. Vance speak out repeatedly about the failure to enact reasonable migration policies. We've seen him also speak out about the value of free speech, because in some European nations, people are routinely imprisoned merely for pointing out the obvious, and that is that migration is dangerous.
I'm afraid Britain has the worst record of all of the countries. And in fact, we've had a lady on this show who was jailed for 31 months for posting on X and deleting the tweet 4 hours later, Lucy Connolly. It is absolutely shocking when you see we've had a case of 2 gang rapes where the people didn't even go to prison at all. And we have a massive problem here with our two-tier justice system. Thank you so much, Keith, for coming on the Liz Truss Show. Wishing you all the best for the elections in Florida and all the best for fighting the blob and the swamp in DC. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good to be with you.